This is OffPlanet Radio.
Up on this November 22nd edition of OffPlanet Radio, I want to introduce to this audience the man who was my first pick of guests to do the JFK special. He has studied the assassination of John F. Kennedy for over 50 years and distinguished himself in 1993 when he presented at the Third Decade Symposium on the Kennedy assassination. He is the first scientist to publicly expose the doctoring of the Zapruder film, and the use of Gestalt Psychology. We want to welcome for this segment Robert Morningstar from UFO Digest. Robert, welcome.
Thank you, Randy. It's an honor to be here, really. Thank you very much.
First question I want to ask you, Robert. You've been studying the Kennedy assassination for 50 years. That's an incredibly arduous and long path, given all the obstacles that we have in our way to uncover the truth about this. Why have you done what you do with the Kennedy assassination?
Oh, quite simply, John F. Kennedy was a childhood hero, and my respect, my admiration, my affection for him was that of a young man looking up to an older brother. I always felt that way about him, about Robert Kennedy. I suppose kinship is the answer, affection, and justice, my sense of justice, and basically that. The sense of justice drives me. It's a spiritual quest. I have a very deep spiritual bond with John F. Kennedy. In a nutshell.
Given that it's taken almost 50 years to even move the popular opinion around, and I think we are seeing that now, moving it around to a place where the general public has now become openly skeptical. Your work in deconstructing the Zapruder film is probably one of the markers, especially for me, in terms of understanding the intricacies of the Kennedy assassination. Can you give us a background on the Zapruder film, your work on it, how you came to be able to do this work, and what exactly was involved in your findings?
Okay. The Zapruder film is supposed to be the actual record of what actually really happened in Dealey Plaza, but it is a complete falsehood. If they had shown us the complete Zapruder film, there's no way that the magic bullet theory could be argued. So what was done by the War Commission is they concocted a theory called the magic bullet theory, and then they had to alter the Zapruder film to fit the theory by extracting segments of the film which would have shown that President Kennedy was hit with gunfire from behind, from the sidewalk, and 2 shots from the grassy knoll. And that, in a nutshell, is why the Zapruder film had to be altered, radically altered, doctored, speeded up, frames cut from one section of it and glued, juxtaposed and glued to other segments of it. A real cartoon, a real Mickey Mouse, right down to things like drawing a false leg on a person to make that person appear that they had kept running. I'm speaking specifically about the little girl, Rosemary Willis. In the Zapruder film that was shown through the 1990s into the early 2000s, it is clear that the little girl, Rosemary Willis, is up on the corner of Houston and Elm, and her plaid skirt disappears behind a concrete abutment. For the next segment, as the motorcycles roll by, there's no one in the background on the sidewalk. And then suddenly, at frame 130, she appears suddenly running, having crossed invisibly from the place where she disappeared at frame 99 and appearing at frame 130. So I called her Transonic Girl because my calculation, I went to Dealey Plaza several times, measured the distance, and I estimated she had to be going at about 620 miles an hour to cover that. But it's obvious. It was a cut, this juncture. And then the little girl actually ran. Her father heard the shots. He called her, Rosemary. She stopped, heard her father. She stopped cold behind a man who also suddenly appears in the background, having not been in the background a couple of frames before. This man is identified as Hugh Metzger. Both feet of the little girl are visible behind the man. Okay, you understand? The man is standing there. He's got a trench coat on. You see his legs. He looks like he's got a camera and an umbrella. And behind him, you see two little legs, one foot on one side of his leg and the other foot on the other side of his leg, which is where the little girl actually stopped. Her father called her and stopped. Then she started running again to go on with the car, which was rolling very slowly, by the way. The car never went more than 11.8, 11.5 miles an hour. So, and in the film, the car appears to be going about 35 miles an hour. So, in order to create the illusion that the motion was continuous from the time she stopped and the time she began her run again, in one of those frames where her initial motion is starting to go again but has not yet gotten going, they drew in a little leg with a marker. And as you can imagine, you've heard of this skill of Oriental carvers and medieval Renaissance carvers who could, for example, carve the Lord's Prayer on a grain of rice.
Yes.
That kind of technology, that kind of skill. Well, that kind of skill was applied to the Zapruder film in this particular frame. Imagine an 8mm frame, which is about, I would say, the size of, a little smaller than your pinky nail. If you look at your pinky nail, an average person, not a giant, you'll get an idea of what the size of a Zapruder frame is, an 8mm frame. So this film had to be taken and put into a viewer whereby a certain kind of mechanical pen, I can't imagine a human being with a hand doing this, but Chinese artists could. This is the other interesting thing. The stroke, that's what writing is called in Chinese. You write in strokes. This particular stroke in Chinese means a human foot. So it's a symbiotic. If you see in airports, you see gangways and you see people walking, a figure of a person taking a step. It'll give you an idea. Well, this little flick of a magic marker creates the illusion that her leg just crossed behind the guy and that she never lost momentum. That's one of the illusions in the film. And I'm going to take some time, if you wish, to describe what you see in the Zapruder film, what you think you see in the Zapruder film, and what you don't see in the Zapruder film, and reconstruct it that way. I've had a lot of practice in the last couple of weeks as I've been on several radio shows describing all the different aspects of the investigation, from the Zapruder film to vapor trails to the swapping of Tippett's body and his
all
brain.
of which we're going to get to in this interview.
So, but basically, it's an optical illusion, a mass hallucination. And the way I got into it was like everybody else. I was watching the night Dan Rather showed the segment of the Zapruder film to the point just before the mortal wound occurred. So they showed it to about Z312 because it's at Z313, frame 313, that the onslaught from the grassy knoll unfolded and two bullets hit President Kennedy, one from the right front, a little high from the porch, and then one from more or less direct front at the grassy knoll, right front and right front, I would say. And one descended, opened up the head, and the other one went through the wound and took out the back of the head. And this is the only explanation that will explain all the wounds, all the witnesses' testimonies, what was seen in Parkland Hospital, the reason for the doctoring of the wounds at Parkland, and so on. So we'll get to the autopsy later. Do you want to ask a question?
Before you go into the technicalities of this, and I know you're going to do a great job with this, given that it's radio, the backdrop on this is that what was the origin of the Zapruder film, and how did it come into the hands of what I assume was either FBI or CIA in order to do the surgery on this?
Okay. Abraham Zapruder was a local businessman who had an office in a building called the Daltex building. It was directly across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. So if the Texas School Book Depositories are in Houston, it was right across the corner, one street crossing over. And this is where it is believed that a shooter was in that building, because in that building, the shooter had a clear and open shot at every point of the president's motorcade, back shot, you know. And Zapruder had an office on the 4th floor, and he had an empty office on the 3rd floor. Mr. Zapruder was associated with a lot of the white Russian community that was vehemently against Kennedy for his soft stand, as they saw it, on communism.
Yes.
And Mr. Zapruder had this amazing camera called the Bell & Howell Electronic Eye movie camera. And one of the reasons for my expertise is that in 1963, my father said to me, "Robert, what do you want for Christmas?" And that camera had just come out. And I had been shooting 8mm movie film, 1963. I was going to be 14. I was 14 years old, but I'd been shooting for 3 years with a Yashica camera, one of these early Japanese cameras.
Yes, I had. Yes, I'm very familiar with Yashicas. Yes.
Three lenses. It had 3 lenses in the front. You could swap it for wide, medium, and close up. Well, when the Optronic Eye camera came out, I flipped out, really, because I was a movie crazy. I was making films and things and doing things. But one of the problems with the other camera, right, was it wasn't reflex. It had a viewfinder on top, and then it had the lens below.
Right.
So this created a parallax. So I couldn't understand why I was shooting people's faces in the center of the camera, and when the film came out, the tops of their heads were cut off. It's very prophetic. It's kind of strange, you know? My friend said, "Oh, that's parallax." So I didn't want a parallax camera. I wanted a reflex through the lens camera. And here, Bell came out, the most beautiful camera of all time. The camera had 3 speeds. You pressed the button up, it took 1 frame, so you could actually do animation, which I did. I tried animation frame by frame, you know, with O'Brien time. So then, if you pressed it gently downwards, it went at either 18 frames per second, or if you pressed it firmly downward, the thing would gear up, it would whir off like, woo, like this, and you'd shoot your film at 24 frames per second. And this is a very important fact. The film could take movies in 2 speeds, 18 frames per second and 24. When Zapruder testified before the Warren Commission, he informed them that he took it at 24 frames per second. When I read that in the Warren Commission report, I said, "Oh my God, he shot the film in slow motion." But that's not what we see in the Zapruder film, you see? So then Arnold Spector and some of the others ganged up on him, and he said, "No." They said, no, Mr. Zapruder, that's not correct. The FBI took your camera and measured it, and they found it was shot at 18 frames per second. And he said, "No, I shot it at 24. And then they there was a certain lull, but he insisted 3 times, "I shot at 24. And what he was telling them without being obvious is, "I shot this movie in slow motion." See?
Yeah.
So, what I was able to prove, I and Roy Schaefer, see, there are a lot of people involved in this. I'm the spokesperson, the vanguard, I suppose, for hundreds of researchers who have worked with me over the past 20 years in particular. And these are wonderful, brilliant people, insightful people. And one of these people is my friend Roy Schaefer, who discovered some of the same things that I'm describing to you. And so this insight Roy Schaefer gave me is one of the most important things that ever happened to me in studying the Zapruder film. He noticed that the flashing lights in front of the limousine alternated on and off, right, left, right, left, right, left. So he found out from the Ford Motor Company that they were 1 second on, 1 second off with a transition period. And when he revealed that in 1994 in Dallas, a friend of mine said to me, "Robert, you should have seen your face when Roy talked about those flashing lights. You looked like you were in heaven. You looked like you were in ecstasy."
This is almost like having a stroboscopic timer.
Exactly. It's a metronome.
Yes.
See, it's a metronome. We had a measure, finally. And that's why I was smiling and ecstatic. Because, you know, when the human brain, the human mind recognizes truth, it's a stimulant. And this is proven by brain studies. When the human brain recognizes truth, it steps up the electrical activity in the brain. You get a boost. You get a surcharge of electricity.
Yes.
But when the brain recognizes falsehood, or is confused, there's a depression in the brain voltage. And these are studies that were done years ago, brain studies, and we can describe them at another time. Let me just say that this fact that when you recognize truth, your brain steps up. It's got a supercharge of electricity, a sense of elation in the recognition of truth. But when falsehood is presented to you, especially falsehood presented as truth, there's a depression in the brain voltage and a depression in your sensations, your feelings. So here we get to the core of why I pursue the Zapruder film. The Zapruder film, when Dan Rather showed it that first time on CBS, so many years after the assassination. Remember, folks, nobody got to see the Zapruder film for years, so they had a lot of time to work it over before they pawned it on the public. But it was in a rough state, and they couldn't really show you what was done to it. Actually, that was what they were hiding. So the movie is run on CBS News at 7 o'clock. Dan Rather, the narrator, who misinformed the public when he said that the next frame the president is thrown violently forward, implying that he was hit by a bullet from the back that drove his body forward. And obviously, that happens when you see the rest of the frames. But be that as it may, I'm watching the film very closely. If you can imagine, JFK having been my childhood hero, how concerned I was to really know.
Yeah.
So I'm watching it, and at this important point where the cars come down the street and it's approaching the sign, all of a sudden at 7 o'clock I'm there in a darkened room glued to the TV set, maybe 3 feet, 4 feet away from it. That's the way I watch TV in my face. And suddenly I blinked. And I went, whoa, how could I blinked? It's because I was concentrating so well. So that ended, and I walked away, and I said, man, how could I have blinked at that? It's such an important point. Because I pride myself on my concentration. You know, I was trained to concentrate. Catholic school makes you do that.
Yes,
in those days.
Under severe duress, yes.
Yeah. Keep your eyes on the blackboard. Anyway, so they bank on that, right? That you keep your eyes on the blackboard. So at 11 o'clock, it was repeated. And I made up my mind, okay, this time I'm really going to see it. I'm really going to concentrate. I'm going to really concentrate on that part that I missed because I blinked. So they run the film again, and there comes the part. The car approaches the sign, and I blinked again. And I went, how could I do that? How could I blink at exactly the same part of the film at 7 o'clock and now? And I walked away with a kind of queasy feeling in my stomach. something didn't make sense about myself, you know. I doubted myself. And I kind of, you know, like, Robert, how could you blink now when you knew you blinked at 7 and you tried not to blink here at 11 and you blinked again? Pardon the expression. What is you know, remonstrating yourself, like punishing yourself. God, I'm ashamed of yourself or myself. So that kind of feeling, it was a very odd feeling, an odd sensation. So that was one instance. The next instance, and this is called cognitive dissonance, this mental state, the psychological confusion, it has a name in psychology because it disrupts your thinking. It disrupts your mental processes as well as your emotions. You're thrown into turmoil because your brain is an instrument designed by nature to recognize and acknowledge truth, right? You can be the biggest liar on the planet, but your brain recognizes, you know, what you're doing. So in the following week or a couple of weeks later, Life magazine came out with frames from the Zapruder film, again showing the action up until President Kennedy got hit. But the way they presented them, the way they juxtaposed them on the page, confused me. And then I started reading the account and trying to correlate the written account to the frames as they were juxtaposed. And it started to drive my brain crazy because it didn't make sense. See? And I kept going, looking at the frame and looking at the paragraphs and looking at the frames and and it was misdirecting my attention, you know? The way it was written was then making it look in an unnatural way, you see?
Yeah.
And I sensed that, and all of a sudden, what I call my conscience now, my guardian angel, starts screaming in my head, stop reading this. Don't look at this. This makes no sense. Put that away. Feelings, these are sensations that were erupting from me, you know, an inner voice. And I said, put that away. Don't look at that. You know, that's not true. And I thought, boy, this is really strange, you know, this sensation. Because I recognize that sensation is odd. You know, we have a rational, logical mind, you're reading. The words of the text are going through your eyes and into your brain, and you're making sentences in your head. And all of a sudden, this inner voice interjects and exclaims, hey, stop reading that. That doesn't make any sense. Put that away. Wow, that was a really strong feeling. And I spent time, you know, on the big 2-page Life magazine. You can still find it, and you can still read it, and you can try to make sense of it. Didn't make sense to me then, and now I know why. Let me jump to 1993, when I got involved again in 1992, because just by chance, around November 21st, I believe it was, of 1991, Hard Copy TV show, you know that show?
I remember that, yes.
Yeah, it was a fine show, and these people pulled out the best copy of the Zapruder film that had ever been shown on television. This particular version has a very interesting history. Zapruder, getting back to Zapruder, took the film because somebody called him and said, hey, Abe, the president's coming down the street. Get your camera. Take a movie. The secretary who answered the phone and gave the message to Zapruder testified later that the voice sounded to her like Jack Ruby. Zapruder knew Jack Ruby. All right, so now Zapruder grabs the camera, runs out, leaves his offices alone because everybody ran out to look at the motorcade. And he went up with his secretary up to an abutment, a concrete abutment on the porch of the near the grassy knoll. It's called the pergola porch. So he climbed up, and he was kind of an unsteady guy, so she claims to have held his legs while he shot the movie. But some photographs taken show that perhaps she and he were both up there. And people don't really know whether she took the movie. Some people argue that she took it, but it doesn't matter. A film was taken. It's called the Zapruder Film. So this film, he ran off after the assassination, and he had it immediately developed. Word got out that somebody had taken a movie and had gotten the assassination on camera, on film. So Richard Stoley of Time magazine went running around Dallas and finding out who the fellow was. Meanwhile, on the other side of Elm Street, they were confiscating, the FBI ran in and started confiscating movie films that were taken by at least 2 other people. And on the other side, ironically, the FBI agent who was confiscating these films was named Regis Kennedy. And yeah,
many synchronicities in this whole thing too.
Unbelievable. So Zapruder took it to be developed. Richard Stoley tracked him down, negotiated with him through the afternoon, getting back and forth to Time Life headquarters, and he was authorized to offer Zapruder $50,000 for exclusive rights to the Zapruder film. And Zapruder made a deal where he gave them the original, he kept a copy, and made a second copy. And I believe the second copy went to the Secret Service, or was to go to the Secret Service. Right? So he signs this $50,000 deal for exclusive rights, commercial rights to be bought by Time Life Incorporated. Time Life gets the film, and, well, it gets shut for a year because the Warren Commission is doing its work, right? So it's evidence, and so nobody but Warren Commission even they didn't get to see it for a long time, or only some of them got to see it. Be that as it may, Time Life locks it up and prints those strips that I talked about just a few minutes ago that were confusing and disjointed. And remember, I mentioned, right, that I had been making 8mm films at 11 years old, my estimate, 10 and a half, 11 years old. So I was really familiar with film strips, you know. I just used to look at them for hours against a light bulb. And then, so my brain reacted to the way these strips were presented. And as it turned out, so many, 40, 30, 35 years later, they found out that, in fact, that they had transposed the frames. They had taken some of those frames and put them in different places in the sequence to fake the first fakery of the magic bullet theory, which was already being concocted. You know, a week after the magic bullet theory was already concocted, and Time Life was part of it. So then, the Zapruder film had to be shown, right? And there was this part of the Zapruder film that they absolutely wanted no one to see. And this was what was hidden behind the sign. What happened when the car went behind the sign? Mr. William Newman was down the street with his wife and kids. You often see him lying down on the grass, holding his child, and his wife is on the grass too, like they spread eagle down when they heard the shots. And rightly so, because Mr. Newman told me personally that the shot that killed President Kennedy came directly from behind him, from wherever he was standing. That was his phrase. He says, listen, I've given interviews in news, ABC, CBS, documentaries over the years, and I always say the same thing, which I'm going to tell you. I never said the shot came from the picket fence in the grassy knoll. I never said that the shot came from the 6th floor depository. The shot came from directly behind where I was standing. And he raised his hand, and this happened on the 35th anniversary of the JFK assassination at about 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the afternoon, after the ceremonies in Dealey Plaza. Mr. William Newman walks into the Adolphus Hotel, and somebody says, hey, Robert, there's William Newman. You know what? I had been waiting to speak to that man since the night of the assassination. Because he was on television, and they showed it over and over and over again that weekend. They repeated the videotape of Mr. Newman and Mrs. Newman being interviewed by CBS. And what Mr. Newman said were these words, as precisely. I mean, I've never forgotten them, so it's as precise as I can give it. He said, "You saw the president's car coming down the street. And then I saw the president stand up. And it seemed like he was going along with a gag or something. And then he sat back down in the car. And then he came by in front of me, and then the shot took his head right off, took his ear right off. And I saw him say that. And his wife nodded, yes, he reacted. We saw something. He stood up. Okay? This is what the closest eyewitness to the actual assassination of President Kennedy, who was not in the limousine, was Mr. William Newman, and his wife and his child. He was holding his kid. Now, here's an interesting thing. Zapruder was panning down. He catches all of the sidewalk, all the people before the sign, right? And the limousine comes down. He zooms. He doesn't zoom. He comes and pans as the limousine is going by. Lamppost goes by. The Cuban disappears. The umbrella man disappears. The Cuban disappears. His arm is up and coming down. And then, no Mr. Newman and his family. Mr. Newman and his family do not appear in the Zapruder film, and they should, because they were standing right there in front of the car when it went by, and they are not shown. So, Mr. Newman has been deleted from the Zapruder film. His actions, his reactions, as I said, the shot came over his right shoulder, it zipped down. And let me describe what Mr. Newman did when he was telling me his story. He told me, the disclaimer, look, they always take my videotapes or my interview and they edit it as if to say that I was saying that it came from the grassy knoll or the Texas School Book Depository. I never said that. I say, as I say today, it came from directly behind where I was standing, whatever behind me is. And then he raised his hands, like taking the oath. Right? And he raised his hand like he was taking the oath. And then he crooked down his wrist, like when you flying with an airplane, you do your hand like zoom, that kind of gesture. You aim it. So he raises his hand like this, and he drops his wrist like that at about a 45-degree angle, and he swoops straight down as if he was seeing it, This is the man who I witnessed the president's head getting blown off, and he was almost hit by the bullet. It came so close to him that he felt the air, and he saw the trail, and he raised his hand, crooked his wrist down, aimed the nose of the plane down, the missile. The missile is the name they give it in the autopsy report for Tippett. The missile is the bullet. And he aims the missile, and he swooped straight down like a jet, accelerating, envisioning the trajectory that he remembered he saw when President Kennedy was killed. And that shot came from the porch, the concrete porch, not far to the right of Zapruder. Zapruder was standing on an abutment and had an extension, then it curved, it bent like an L, and a walkway, and on that walkway, there's a porch, concrete porch. You keep walking down that walkway, you come down to stairs that will lead you to the street. But before you go down those stairs, you're on that walkway. To the right is the picket fence, and it corners off with the railroad yard. So there you have a clear picture.
Question for you. How close today is the landscape at the grassy knoll from what it was in 1963? Are the landmarks fairly well preserved at this point, Robert?
A very, very good question. Again, Roy Schaefer found out that immediately after the assassination, several things were done. For example, the concrete block where a bullet hit and wounded James Tague. Remember, there was a guy standing down the street, and the first bullet missed, but he missed by so much it had to be intentional. Nobody could miss the car, much less the president, but to miss the car completely and hit the bullet so far down the street on the left side was intentional. Now, why? Because a Secret Service driver going down the street would hear the shots, see the ricochet, and instinctively turn the limousine away from the left side and go toward the right, evading what he would perceive as the danger. that would bring him closer to the kill zone instead of being more to the left or in the center lane. It would veer over a little inch closer to the curb, which is what they wanted to do. Because waiting on the curb in front of the sign was a shooter, and waiting on the porch was a rifleman, and waiting behind the grassy knoll picket fence was a badge man. And from the Daltex building, as I said, it's a report. That's what a gunshot is called. The report of a shot was heard from the Daltex building, and there is a vapor trail in the Zapruder film that I discovered at frame Z295. This is one of my first and best discoveries, was a vapor trail that appears in frame 295. It came from the left side of the limousine from a very, very high angle, and it bounced off the right side of President Kennedy's head, just above the ear. And that bullet just went like that and bounced into Governor Connolly, going right through him. So one bullet did hit two men, but it didn't travel the magic trajectory. It was just a billiard shot. It was just a little miss. It nicked the skull, boom, went on right through Connolly. Connolly, turning around, was hit by a different bullet from the front that went through his wrist and then went into his thigh. So this is very important, this vapor trail evidence that I discovered, because it proves another shooter from another building, a steeper angle, and the trajectory crossing from left to right, from where President Kennedy was relative to Connolly. They could not have originated from the Texas School Book Depository. And this is, I have wonderful news. You have to see Bill Hemmer's special on Fox News on the assassination that was done earlier in the month, and it's being repeated. It took this information and they put it into a computer, and they isolated the place from which this shot that I'm describing came was the County Records Building. And the County Records Building is the building that is adjacent to the Dallas Sheriff's Office. So the confluence of hatred of President Kennedy created the union of the hate factions that all joined together in brotherhood, a dark brotherhood, to get rid of the thorn in their side. And that dark alliance was the military-industrial complex, the mafia, the CIA, the United States Air Force and General LeMay giving assent or pushing it, and of course the one who gained most and stood most to lose if Kennedy lived, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So Lyndon Baines Johnson was going to impeach, and the vote was coming down on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, when the Senate committee that was investigating him for bribery and for corruption and for a land scam deal that he did in Texas.
This was the Billy Celestes affair, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly so. Exactly so. And it was that Lyndon Johnson was in hot water, had been discovered to be complicit in the Billy Celestes land scam affair. The end was coming for Lyndon Johnson. And so the Senate began the investigation. The findings were being readied, were given. The Senate committee had gone through them, and the vote on his impeachment was to be held, was to have been held at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. The only way that Johnson could avoid prison was to become President of the United States by 12:30 on November 22nd, 1963. So that's the way I see it. And I'm really down on Johnson. I really consider Lyndon Johnson to have been very much like as close as we have come to Hitler. his manipulation of information, his murders, multiple murders of enemies. And the murders didn't stop with Lyndon Johnson. The murders in the aftermath that were needed to silence dissenting witnesses who would not agree that only 3 shots were fired and would say, no, 6 to 9. Or more importantly, in 1994, when I really got into the Tippit angle of it, and the murders of, some murders, a lot of accidents and so suicided, people. Yeah. I said to myself, well, we've heard about all these people. What I really want to know is, what were they talking about? And invariably, the majority, I would say, of the people, the most interesting people that were knocked off, were people who knew or learned somehow of the Jack Ruby Tippit connection, or the Jack Ruby Lee Oswald connection. And these people who talked about it, like Hank Kellum, he talked openly about Tippit and Ruby being buddies, being so tight. I'm going to quote you something. I'm going to tell you, these guys were so tight that Tippit would ride around in his squad car, and Ruby would ride around with him in the passenger seat playing detective or trying to look like detectives. And so he got into that mystique that he was in with the cops. But he was so in with the cops that Tippit was enlisted to be one of his assistants. Tippit was a corrupt cop. I got this from the Lady in Red. The Lady in Red is the lady in the red raincoat that appears in the Zapruder film in the background. At precisely this moment, you can find this vapor trail if you get the movie JFK, which has the best. It's got a Cray supercomputer-enhanced version of the Zapruder film. Mm-hmm. And if you see that, they're showing it in the courtroom, and you can stop it at the point where the lady in the red raincoat is in the background. That's the point just before her raincoat crosses behind their heads. That's the point at which this vapor trail appears in frame Z295.
Yeah, we're speaking here, of course, of the Oliver Stone film.
Yeah, well, the Oliver Stone film, the Zapruder film that they show in the Oliver Stone film.
Yes.
Zapruder, right.
The film within
the movie,
film.
JFK. I tell you, folks, they try to discredit and demonize Oliver Stone. He's an American hero. He restored the truth about the JFK assassination in that movie. You will never see a clearer depiction of the assassination, right down to Badgeman shooting from the grassy knoll. You'll never see a more accurate depiction of the forces. Some of them symbolic. What the big criticism. Mr. X appears in the film and gives them all that information about the helicopters in Vietnam and blah, blah, blah. So the big criticism, that didn't really happen. Okay, they dramatized a letter that was written to Jim Garrison by Fletcher Prouty, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, a very, very honorable officer who also worked in the JFK assassination field, revealing to the public, the first man to reveal to the public that President Kennedy was killed by a special team of assassins. That's what his book is called, The Special Team. Mm-hmm. And that this special team of assassins was part of the Department of Defense, and that it operated out of a special committee. He didn't name it when he was writing about it. He didn't name it explicitly, but I can tell you the name of the committee. It was called the 5412 Committee. And this was the Executive Action Committee.
Say that again. I didn't quite catch it. What was the name of the committee again, Robert?
5412. Okay. 5412.
Okay.
The 5412 Committee was the Executive Action Committee of the CIA and the military to get rid of undesirables like Fidel Castro. So the big plan of the 5412 Committee in the 1950s was to assassinate Castro after he turned communist. And this is where the marriage of the mafia and the CIA occurred. in 1959, somebody got the idea that it would really be good if we could knock off Castro. But, well, we can't do it ourselves if, Americans are caught. Well, it'd really be nice if the mafia knocked them off, wouldn't it? Well, yeah, that would be a good idea, and they really do have a reason. He stripped them of everything.
Of their casino rights during the Batista regime, correct?
But let me tell you something else. We've all heard about the treasure of Sierra Madre.
Yes.
Right? A hidden treasure. Well, I tell you, in my gut, the mafia was siphoning all its holdings into Havana and into Cuba. It was the mafia-owned island under the corrupt administration of Batista, who preceded Castro, who was the dictator. And I have a certainty, I swear, that there's some mountain or some hill there in which the mafia stashed a hoard. Now, when Castro came in, here's what happened to the mafia. He came in and he gave them 3 days to get out. And the only thing they could take was the clothes on their backs and one suitcase. And I think that loot is still there, hidden somewhere where only some old mafioso knows, where the big secret is. And they have been dying to get Cuba back. The mafia, right? Once that happened, not only their buildings, their cars, their, pardon the expression, their whorehouses, right? Their gambling. Can you imagine how much money they were making in the heyday of the mafia in Havana?
Well, and younger people, or people who are not studied in the history of that time, probably don't realize that the backdrop to the rise of Castro coming into power had a lot to do with the corrupt goings-on within Cuba itself. That basically there was this vacuum that formed around the corruption that enabled Castro, empowered by Marxism, to come in.
Well, here's the paradox. At that time, the U.S. government was playing both ends against the middle. At the same time that they were supporting Batista and propping him up, they were supporting Castro in the revolution. And here we have the great presence of this unique person, this really unique person in this whole scheme of things, who is Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, dealing guns to Castro during the Cuban Revolution before Castro became a Marxist. And then Jack Ruby was involved in running guns to the anti-Castro Cubans after Castro turned Marxist. Jack Ruby had deep relations and deep roots with Cuban mafia. And Jack Ruby traveled to Cuba in 1959, September of 1959, I believe, if I recall correctly. It's definitely 1959. And this was one of the horrible secrets that they had to hide about Ruby. You know what the biggest secret they had to hide about Ruby was? Ruby had been working for Richard Nixon since 1947, at which time he was enlisted as an informant for Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon wrote to the FBI to exercise FBI cover and FBI protection of Jack Ruby because he was conducting operations undercover for Richard Nixon. And one of those was the gun-running operations to Cuba. I mentioned the 5412 Committee, right? The 5412 Committee was an assassination committee. I call that executive action. When you hear executive order,
yes.
It's not that executive. It's like execute. Okay?
Yes.
Execution is an executive action. Okay? So that was a function. So, in order to protect the president, Eisenhower, give him plausible deniability, President Eisenhower was not told about the existence of the 5412 Committee. It was a CIA, Department of Defense, operation run, but it was chaired by the Vice President of the United States. Now here we come to the deepest irony of all in this scheme, the power structure, the secret intelligence power structure of Washington, 1958, 59, 60, 61 to 63, okay? The 5412 Committee is the ultimate secret assassination committee. And in 1959, as I was sarcastically describing this hypothetical conversation, but the outcome is the same, somebody had the idea in the CIA that it would be great to get rid of Castro. How do we do it? Well, we have to get a third party to do it. We can't do it ourselves. Let's get cutouts. Cutouts is a term in intelligence work where you have intermediaries that separate you, right, from the last link in the chain. So if the last link in the chain is the killers in Dealey Plaza, the foregoing links are the organizers, the suppliers, the logistics, the communications, coming back with stages of leadership or oversight, right? These people between the guys that get the big idea, like the CIA and the 5412 Committee that hatched the idea, they have to get people that are distanced from them, that cannot be associated with them, to conduct that operation so that they have plausible deniability, right? So, and they want to have several layers of it, right? So that if Lee Oswald lived, he was supposed to die. Tippett was supposed to kill him, or so he thought. Oswald didn't die. Next stage, backtrack one more, we got to get somebody who's really in hot water to do it, because he's going to be in hotter water if he doesn't do it. Mm-hmm. And this is where we get to the crux of the matter of why Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. A, he knew him. B, they worked together, were seen together many times. Oswald was seen at his carousel club by many people, including Jack Ruby's strippers, who ID'd him after the assassination. But most importantly, Jack Ruby was one of the assassins. And now we get back to the sign. Whatever was in front of the sign has been hidden for 50 years. When you see the Nix film, he panned across the whole thing, but it starts after the sign. So after President Kennedy's been hit in the back and in the throat, that is excluded. The Bronson film, the same thing. It starts off just after the car passes the sign. But we know that it was at the sign, or as the car went behind the sign, that President Kennedy first reacted to being shot. And his reactions were these. The Secret Servicemen heard him say, "Oh my God, I've been shot." And Arnold Specter and some of the Warren Commission advocates said, no, that's not possible. The first shot was a throat shot, and with the throat shot, President Kennedy could never have spoken or voiced anything. And they said, no, we heard him. We heard him say, "Oh my God, I've been shot." And then they get into it. And he said, no, it's a throat shot. He couldn't have spoken. He said, and then they don't relent. The Secret Service men were telling the truth, Kellerman and Greer. Mm-hmm. And they're there together, and they don't relent. You're not going to tell me what I heard, basically, right? Secret Servicemen telling these Senate, the commission lawyers. And the lawyer says to him, "How can you be so sure that it was President Kennedy?" And the man says to him, "He said it in a Boston accent." And that ended that, right? So, the first shot was not the throat shot. The first shot was a descending shot, a steep angle shot. It descended at an angle of 40 degrees. 40 to 60 degrees is what they say in the autopsy report. And that bullet went down into President Kennedy and went into his abdomen, his stomach area. Right? Imagine that comes down from a high building between the shoulder blades and goes badoom, right through, down. So that's why President Kennedy, he emerges from behind the sign, originally has his hands on his abdomen. If you're shot with a bullet in the back and it goes down into your stomach and forward into your abdomen, you're not going to reach back for your back. You feel the hot lead down in the belly. Yeah. And his hands, and that's the point where he jumped too, right? What's your reaction? reflexive reaction, right?
Yeah.
So this is the point where Mr. Newman saw this and said, oh, the president looked like he was going along with a gag or something, right? But the gag involved two shots almost simultaneously. The back shot and what I'm going to tell you now. Jack Ruby was standing in front of the sign, and he had his dog with him on a leash, and he had a camera covering the gun. He had borrowed a Polaroid camera that day from one of his acquaintances because he wanted to take a picture of the president as he came down in the parade, right? So what he did is he waited, he lay in wait, holding the camera and gun in hand, and just the same way that we all saw him leap out and kill Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby leapt out as if going to take a picture, Polaroid, and boom! He put the bullet in Kennedy's throat. So that's the sequence. The bullet that entered President Kennedy's throat was a wound of entry and a very small bullet. I met Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who wrote Conspiracy of Silence with Gary Shaw, another great investigator, JFK assassination researcher. And I met Dr. Crenshaw twice, once in Chicago and once in Dallas, and we had conversations. And he said to me, Robert, he showed me his pinky. He said, the bullet that went in President Kennedy's throat was a small caliber bullet in a small hole. It's no bigger than my pinky, and he showed me his pinky. And he said, the tracheotomy that Dr. Perry did was just a small incision. He was an artist. What you see in the JFK autopsy photographs, the throat wound, that's the work of a butcher. Those are his very words to me. And he was standing there, looking over in the trauma room, at the operating table, as all the other doctors, Dr. Perry and the others, tried to save President Kennedy's life. But they knew instantly from the wound, the magnitude of the wounds, plural, and the missing brain, missing right hemisphere of the brain, that it was impossible for any human to live. And yet, because part of the back of President Kennedy's brain was intact, and yet his heart keeps beating for 30 minutes. He shot at 12:30, and his heart continued to beat until 1 o'clock, even though he was brain dead from the moment of the shot. The autonomic nervous system continued. His will to live, I would say, the carnal will to live, was fake. So Jack Ruby then was one of the assassins. And Oswald was supposed to be the fall guy. So when Oswald lived, he lived through the movie theater situation. He was supposed to be shot and killed and then, presented as the trophy. But he was wily enough to escape with his life. And that mandated, because you know what? Lee Harvey Oswald had worked for the CIA, had done his job, had gone to Russia and come back, and then he was hired as an informant. And he was working as an informant both for the CIA and for the FBI. And his role down there was to infiltrate local organizations that might pose a threat to the U.S. government fanatically, whether they were Cubans, anti-Castro Cubans, or the Minutemen. Oswald attended, functions of anti-Castro Cubans, pro-Castro Cubans, the Minutemen. He made a report, basically a complaint. He made a report and a complaint that General Walker had a meeting the month before the assassination in October, when Adlai Stevenson went down to Dallas. He was mobbed, he was pelted, pilloried, hit with signs, had eggs thrown at him, completely, totally disrupted when he went to a UN convention, a UN meeting that was scheduled for Dallas. And this was a vehement reaction because President Kennedy had tried to create cooperation with the Russians in space, and he was talking about unilateral disarmament of our nuclear weapons, and so that was really quite radical. I think it was really way over the top, especially the idea that we should disarm all the world's nations, Russia and we should turn over our nuclear weapons to the wisdom of the United Nations to exercise that and wield that power.
Yeah.
So those were things that were in the air, you see, that caused this incredible hatred and hostility. Not to mention, and this is important with regard to the Warren Commission, not to mention that after the Bay of Pigs operation, which was kept secret from him, it was most likely the 5412 committee operation. There was operations was not just killing individuals, but psychological operations and, rebellions, incursions, sabotage. All of these things were under the oversight of the CIA, the Latin American Bureau there. Because we knew, actually, after Castro became a communist, the KGB moved into Havana, and the head of the KGB's Department 13 was stationed in Havana, Viktor Kostakov, and Department 13 was basically the terrorist arm of the CIA, of the KGB.
Mm-hmm.
Terrorist arm. I say terrorism because they practice extortion, terrorism, execution. They call it wet works.
Right.
Wet work in the jargon of intelligence is assassinations, wet operations. And so Kostakov was in Havana. And so they were aware then of this threat, And Kennedy talked about, in one of his last speeches, about subversion, that we were up against communism. But he was talking in that speech in double entendres. He was talking about internal subversion and external subversion. And he referred to communist subversion, sabotage, assassinations, and so on. And a lot of people think that he was kind of being psychic or a prophet. No, sir. President Kennedy knew that there were assassination plots against him because one of them had been foiled in Miami when he reconciled himself with the Cubans. People don't remember the Cuban Bay of Pigs was a disaster, and 1,500 Cuban soldiers, loyal Cuban soldiers, were captured and imprisoned, tortured by Castro. President Kennedy worked from that time, 1961 through 63, to retrieve those men. And he finally made a diplomatic breakthrough and was able to secure the release of the remaining survivors and brought them all home. And thereby he placated the Cuban community and the anti-Castro community to some degree, in that he had gotten back their loved ones in return for food and medicine that he gave to Castro. So that too was seen as soft on communism, and also looked frowned upon, because it showed that Kennedy was negotiating with Castro and not intending to invade Cuba as they had planned. And the plan was, in the Pentagon, Department of Defense, to invade Cuba in December 1963. And I can tell you that directly because we have the files, we have the papers of that describe Operation Northwoods, which was to be a false flag terror attack or operation in Miami that was supposed to be pinned on Castro. The public would be convinced that Castro did it, and that casus belli, cause for war and invasion of Cuba. Kennedy had gone through the crisis of the missile crisis and almost stumbled into nuclear war and wanted no part of that. And as a result, he basically made an armistice with Castro. He agreed with Khrushchev to remove Jupiter missiles in Turkey, something that was not told to the American public there was a quid pro quo. The way the deal was presented in America was Khrushchev is going home with his tail between his legs. He's taking his missiles and his technical advisors with him. Quite to the contrary, the secret part of the deal was the United States took out Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which was tantamount to the same thing that Khrushchev had tried to do by planting them in Cuba, except Turkey is contiguous to Russia.
Uh-huh.
So we put our nuclear missiles in Turkey. And as a result of their negotiations, Kennedy, and they were actually they were quite obsolete already, but they were there. They had nuclear warheads. And we were going now on to the intercontinental ballistic missile era. Those were intermediate missiles, right? So we see that we don't need those anymore. And Kennedy said, okay, we'll take out the Jupiter missiles. You take out your missiles. And I promise not to invade Cuba. A promise which he intended to keep. And yet, Operation Northwoods was on the board. And so when he refused the Joint Chiefs' plan to invade Cuba in 1963 and to go more deeply into Vietnam, those are two things that he did. He ordered a staged withdrawal from Vietnam to have begun in December, Christmas of 1963. Christmas gift President Kennedy to the American people was no more Vietnam. 1,000 of their troops were supposed to be brought home. That was given in a national security memorandum the week, days before he was killed. So, here's another. There were a whole series of national security memoranda that were Kennedy wrote, but were kept secret for years and years and years. And one of the most recent ones dealt with Kennedy demanding that all B-52s and nuclear-tipped missiles be have gadgetry that would permit the president to recall or destroy it up to the last minute before the attack on Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So that fail-safe could happen. You know the film?
Yes, I remember seeing this, yeah.
Right. So basically, he had that fail-safe scenario in his head. And because that was the fact, once we sent our B-52 force on an attack mission, our pilots were trained, don't believe anything you hear. You get that code, open up that envelope, arm the nukes, get to Moscow, get to Minsk, get to Leningrad and Stalingrad, get rid of them all. Boom. No matter what you say, what you hear, what you see, those are your orders, and they were indoctrinated to do that. And Kennedy realized, my God, if one of them makes a mistake, we have to have a way of calling them back. So that was one of the most important memoranda that he wrote. He demanded that Curtis LeMay put a recall function in all the B-52s whereby the president could terminate an attack even up to the last minute before the bombs were dropped.
You bring up an interesting point here. You mentioned General Curtis LeMay. Do you think that General Curtis LeMay also had a dog in the fight to have President Kennedy taken out?
Absolutely. He even said it. 2 years before it happened. As I said, 1 year before it happened, it was after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when LeMay really actually tried to start a nuclear war. He launched missiles across the Pacific, 2 missile launches without telling the president. And the president thought, what is going on? This guy's a nut. He's actually trying to start the war. What if the Russians thought those launches were our attack, the beginning of our attack? So, yes, General Curtis LeMay was a real war hawk. And when a peaceful resolution occurred as a result of Kennedy and Khrushchev's negotiations, and the missile crisis was resolved without war, President Kennedy had a celebration. He ordered everyone in the ExComm, the Executive Committee, National Security Council, all the people who had sat around those tables, that table, during the crisis and came to the peaceful resolution, he wanted to have a celebration, so he called for one, and they sent invitations to everyone, including all the Joint Chiefs and the Bundys and the McNamaras. But when the invitation got to LeMay, he said, "God damn those son of a bitches. You should go in there right now and kill the two of them," referring to Robert Kennedy and JFK. So, yes, he was involved in it. The military-industrial complex was very much involved in it. The people who made the M16s, Eugene Stoner, he had a lot to lose. He'd come up with the most amazing weapon, the M16, and they foresaw in Vietnam thousands and thousands of sales, of this amazing weapon. And all of a sudden, Kennedy said, "We're not going to Vietnam." So the Armalite Corporation started to lose a hell of a lot in revenue and losses because, it takes a huge amount of research and development to go from a Garand rifle, an M1 or an M14. I mean, it's a quantum leap from an M14 to an M16. M14.
Yes, they're amazing rifles. And they had a long shelf life in terms of being used by our military.
Right, and other militaries of the world. An excellent weapon, but you can't compare the fire, the rapid fire, to what an M16 can do.
Right.
And this is another one of my my theories was that there was an M16, at least one M16 involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Because some people said that they thought they heard a burst, not an ordinary rifle shot. And just as the Zapruder camera, the Bell & Howell optronic eye camera, had 3 settings, so did the M16. The M16 had one setting where it was pull the trigger once, one bullet comes out. You had fully automatic. It's a machine gun, but that had a unique middle switch, which was the 3-shot burst. You could aim 16 in that mode, pull the trigger once, and 3 bullets came out instantly. And I believe that one of the shots involved that, and that one is the one that hit Governor Connolly in the wrist and bounced down into his thigh. I want to show people how badly you've been fooled. I told you, I was fooled. I was fooled on a very deep, deep subconscious level.
Let's go back to that for a minute. What happened there with that, your inability to be able to focus at that critical point in the film twice in the same evening?
No, I didn't finish the story. I started to go into it, and I digressed. In 1992, once I got this really great copy of the Zapruder Film and found the editing and the cuts and the chops, I started collecting all possible previous versions of it. And lo and behold, I found that version that was shown by Dan Rather and CBS News in a particular documentary where they had sold that version to PBS to do a special on the Kennedy assassination that's narrated by Walter Cronkite. And in that documentary, they showed that film, and I taped it, right? Because I had very advanced Panasonic VHS slow motion frame by frame equipment, so I was throwing tapes in there, and that's how I got the original, the really great version, 35 millimeter copy of the Zapruder Film to start my work. So I'm copying all of these previous transmissions of the Zapruder Film, and I start to see the discrepancies between different copies. And when I get to this Walter Cronkite one, the Dan Rather version, I start watching it and realize, oh, this is the one that I was watching when I was a kid, that time in '68, And there I see it. I blinked. I blinked twice on the night they showed it back there in the 1960s, and I was befuddled by it. But this time it didn't fool me, because I saw the black frame go by. See, the doctoring of the Zapruder Film is so crude at the part where it goes behind the sign, they cut a lot of film out of there. Remember, I said he came down, he got shot in the back, he said, "Oh my God, I've been shot." That's most likely when he stood up, right? And then he plopped down, boom, shot through the throat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mr. Zapruder told the Warren Commission, "I saw the president's head pop up above the sign." No, I saw the president behind the sign. And they said, "No, that's impossible. He was blocked by the sign." He said, "No, I saw his head pop up above the sign," right, as he was looking through the viewfinder.
Yes.
They said, "That's not possible." And they said, "No, I told you, I saw the president's head pop up the sign behind the sign." And then we have Mr. Newman down the street who on that night said, "I saw the president stand up in the car as if he was going along with a gag or something." Okay, so now we know what the Zapruder film at the sign. You would have seen the car coming, disappearing behind the sign. You would have seen a red-headed man stand up, his head pop up, and like periscope. Periscope up, periscope down. That's what you would have seen. And that had to be cut. But the cut is so crude, and it's obvious and visible. It looks like two pieces of 8mm film, 2 frames, of the back of the sign, superimposed over each other, overlaid, overlapped, and glued with a green glue and a black marker streak across the whole thing. That was the first big splash that I found in the Zapruder film at the sign.
And how did you locate that? How did you locate that particular splice? Was that a result of videotaping that you were able to do that?
Oh, right. Videotape. The films we're talking about were taken. The other 8mm films were all taken at 18 frames per second.
Right.
The Hughes film, the Nix film, the Towner film, and so on. The Bell film, all are 18 frames per second. The Zapruder film is at 24 frames per second.
Right.
So
they couldn't have theoretically interchanged these different films over time, or they could have.
By deleting frames, they changed the appearance of the time. One of the things about the Zapruder film is the illusion the car never stopped and that the car was going fast. I mentioned before, Zapruder said he shot at 24. And this is, here, I would say something about technical stuff before we go into the videotape. But the films are shot at 18 frames per second or 24 frames per second, but when you show them or videotape them and show them on a videotape, they're played back to you at 30 frames per second.
Right.
Okay? So if you got 24 frames, some of the frames are going to be videotaped twice, right? And some only once.
Exactly,
so Right, it makes it difficult at times to count exactly the frames, which is why it led me to a wrong count. When I found the cut, I tried to count to what is Z295, but on the video I counted enough frames that as I thought they were frames individually, and I thought it was 307 in the beginning. Be that as it may, the Zapruder film is reduced. It's accelerated to appear at going at 35 miles an hour, and it's an illusion. So what's removed from the Zapruder film is the stop behind the sign when President Kennedy was first shot and stood up and sat down, and then continues as the car began to move again after the first shots, and the driver turned around to see what was happening. He was driving very, very slowly. And then the onslaught came when they hit the kill zone. And when that first shot, the headshot came, and Mr. Greer was looking back at the president, his reaction was to hit the brake. The car stopped. Whoa! You see?
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, that is masked. It's not removed from the Zapruder film, but it's masked. It's disguised. And the disguise is very, very subtle, and it took me years to figure out what was going on. Someone pointed out that at this part of the film, after Z313, the president's head goes back, and then all of a sudden, a few frames later, everybody's leaning forward. That is the proof that the guy hit the brake. Because all the bodies that are seated back, Jackie taking care of Jack, Connolly, Mrs. Connolly, all of a sudden there's a lurch, and even the passenger, Kellerman, all their bodies go forward suddenly, and they're all inclined at the same time. But in that particular frame, the car is clear in focus, and the background is clearly in focus. And you can't have that. If you're tracking a moving vehicle, and you're tracking the vehicle well, the vehicle is in perfect focus, and the background is blurry. If you lag on the moving vehicle and fix the background, the vehicle is blurry. In these frames, there are several frames where both the background and the vehicle are in focus. And yet, the illusion is that it's moving. So how do they do it? Watch the Zapruder film very carefully immediately after the headshot, right? Immediately after the president's head explodes. Very strange things happen. Everybody's thrown forward because the car brakes, but you think it's going. And the reason is they put in a white spot into the film in successive frames, and they moved it across the frame so that when the car stopped and actually broke and stopped and was stopped for a few seconds, the white dot that they put into the film migrates slowly from the near right side of the frame to next to the near right side of the frame, to the middle of the frame, to the left side of the frame. And by basically moving the dot across the background, they make you believe the car was moving. Do you understand?
Yeah, I do. I'm visualizing.
Understand Walt Disney. That's why I say it's a Mickey Mouse film.